On a November morning in 1718, a pirate captain lost everything to a show of hands. The night before, Charles Vane had spotted a French warship and refused to attack. In the chase, his word was law, and his crew obeyed. But at first light, they took a vote. Some 90 men, and only about 15 stood with him. They branded him a coward, stripped his command, gave his ship to his own quartermaster, and put him off in a small sloop, the most feared man in those waters, out of a job by breakfast. This is how the pirate code ran a ship. We remember pirates as pure chaos. Drunk, lawless, every man for himself, a floating riot with a flag. And the crews that actually succeeded were close to the opposite of that. Before a single sail went up, a pirate company would sit down together and write itself a constitution. They called it the Articles. Every man aboard signed it or swore to it, and once it was signed, it ran the ship. Who led, who ate, who got paid, and how much. What happened to the man who stole, or ran, or drew a blade on a shipmate? It was written law. Agreed by men, the law on land had already marked for the gallows. And in a few ways that should genuinely surprise you, it was stricter and fairer than almost any government those men had ever lived under. If you want the record instead of the legend, subscribe and stay with me, because the legend gets the pirate captain more wrong than anything else in the story. Start with the signing, because that's where the government began. This didn't come out of nowhere. A generation earlier, the buccaneers of the Caribbean had sailed under something they called the chasse party, a hunting agreement that spelled out how the spoils got divided before anyone fired a shot. Alexandre Exquemelin, a Frenchman who sailed with those buccaneers as a ship's surgeon and wrote it all down in 1678, describes crews settling the shares and the rules by common consent in advance so no one could argue about it later. The pirates of the Golden Age took that idea and hardened it into a full code of government. The buccaneers had been rough men hunting Spanish shipping out of Tortuga and Jamaica, half-legal raiders operating on the edge of empire. When the wars ended and the governments that had licensed them turned around and outlawed them, a lot of those same men kept sailing and kept fighting, only now with no flag behind them and no port that would have them. They had no state left. So they built a small one on the deck, out of the only material they had, which was each other, and a set of rules everyone agreed to in advance. The signing itself carried a terrible weight. A crew coming together, sometimes men from 3 or 4 captured ships thrown in with each other, would agree on a set of articles before they went hunting. Somebody read them out. Then every man put his name to the page, or his mark if he couldn't write, and swore to obey. Charles Johnson, whose 1,724 account is still the best source we have for how these crews ran, says they swore on a Bible when they had one, and on a hatchet or a pair of cross pistols when they didn't. And it wasn't only done once, at the start. Every new man the crew took on had the articles read to him and had to sign or swear before he could claim a single share of anything. The rules came first, then the plunder. The exceptions were the men taken by force for their skills, the surgeons, the carpenters, the navigators, and the musicians, who were kept whether they signed or not. Everyone else chose it with their eyes open, and that choice was the whole foundation the ship stood on. That signature was more than a promise. To the crown, putting your name to a set of pirate articles was itself an act of piracy, proof enough to hang you. So the oath bound a man twice over, to his crewmates and to the rope. Years later, when the navies finally hunted these crews down, that signature was exactly what the courts came looking for. In 1722, off the coast of West Africa, the Crown captured one of the largest pirate companies of the entire age and put its men on trial at a fort called Cape Coast Castle. It was the biggest mass trial for piracy the era would ever see. And the whole thing turned on one question. Had you signed on willingly, or had you been forced? The men who could prove they'd been dragged aboard against their will and had never truly thrown in with the company mostly walked free. The men who'd put their name to the articles by choice, who'd made themselves citizens of that little floating republic, were the ones who hanged, more than 50 of them, some left in chains along the shore as a warning to every sailor who passed. There was no honor in how it ended. Dozens of Africans the crew had taken off slave ships were simply sold back into slavery by the same court. But look at what the trial proves about the signing. To have signed those articles freely was, in the eyes of the law, to have confessed. That signature carried real legal weight. It marked the line between a prisoner and a pirate, and everyone involved knew it. The men made these rules, and the men agreed to be bound by them. That's the thing the cliché misses. These men hadn't escaped the law. They'd sat down and written their own, from the deck up. The system had a give to it too. Every article needed the consent of every man, and when a crew couldn't agree on who should lead or where to go, the answer wasn't a knife fight. The men who wanted something different would draw up their own articles, take a ship, and simply sail away to hunt on their own terms. That flexibility was a strength and a weakness at once. It let a crew split cleanly instead of tearing itself apart. But it also meant pirate government could never really hold a stubborn minority for long. Consent was the whole foundation, and consent could always walk. Now look at the first rule on almost every surviving list, because it's the one that should stop you cold. Every man has a vote in affairs of moment, and that vote reached all the way down. Every hand had it, not just the officers, one man and one voice. Where to sail, which ship to chase, whether to take a royal pardon, what to do with a prisoner. All of it went to the whole company as a general council, and the majority carried it. And these weren't quiet, orderly meetings. The whole crew gathered on the open deck, and any man could stand up and speak his piece. The powder monkey, the same as the master gunner. They argued it out in plain view, loudly, sometimes for hours, and then they counted heads. Once the vote was in, it was settled, and a man who'd lost the argument was still bound by the outcome, because he'd agreed in advance to be bound by it. That was the trade. You got a real voice, and in exchange you honored the result even when it went against you. Set that against the world these men came from. On a Royal Navy ship, a sailor who so much as questioned an order could be flogged for it. On a pirate ship, questioning the plan was expected, because until the company had spoken, there was no plan. And they built it this way for a hard reason. Most of these men had come off merchant and navy ships, where a cruel captain could beat them half to death, and no one above him lifted a finger. Wages went unpaid for months, and then vanished when an owner decided to cheat them. Food rotted in the barrel while the master ate well in his cabin. A bosun's mate could open a man's back with a rope's end for the smallest thing, and there was no one to appeal to, because the master was the law, and the law was whatever the master felt like that morning. One sailor turned pirate later testified that his old commander had used the crew barbarously, that poor men like him could never get justice, and that officers were free to abuse them like dogs with nothing said. Men who had survived that did not want another master they couldn't answer. They wanted a government they could hold in their own hands. Which brings us to the captain, and to the biggest myth in the entire subject. The picture in your head is a tyrant in a long coat, absolute master of the ship, cutting down anyone who crosses him. That man mostly did not exist. A pirate captain was elected. The crew voted him in, and the crew could vote him straight back out again, for almost any reason they liked. Cowardice, bad judgment, a run of empty holds. Johnson put it about as plainly as it can be put. They permit him to be captain, he wrote, only on the condition that they may be captain over him. So what did the captain actually control? Two things: the chase and the fight. When the ship was running down a prize or trading fire at close range, there was no time to hold a debate, and the crew handed him total authority. In that window, he was as absolute as any admiral who ever lived. His order was final and instant, and a man who disobeyed it in the thick of a battle could be cut down where he stood. They gave him that power on purpose, because they understood something simple. You cannot run a boarding action or a gun duel by committee. Someone has to decide, in the same breath, and everyone else has to move. So they lent him a king's authority for exactly as long as the danger lasted, and the instant it passed, they took every bit of it back. In the chase, he was a king. Every other hour, he was closer to a passenger with a nicer hat. He didn't get a private stock of food. On a great many ships, he didn't even get a cabin to himself, and the men could wander into his quarters whenever they pleased. His pay was barely above theirs. And the moment the guns went quiet, most of his power went quiet with them. That is exactly what undid Charles Vane. In the chase, when he called off that attack on the French warship, the crew obeyed, because in the chase they had no choice. But the next morning, out of the fight, they were the government again. They looked at a captain who'd waved off a fat prize, called it cowardice, and voted him gone. The man who replaced him, Jack Rackham, the one most accounts name as Vane's quartermaster, would become famous as Calico Jack. Vane hadn't been beaten in a battle. The crew had simply outvoted him. And here's the grim postscript. Vane scraped together another small crew, got wrecked by a hurricane, and washed up marooned and alone on an uninhabited island. When he was finally spotted and picked up, it was by men who knew his face, and he went to the gallows in Jamaica in 1721. The captain who lost his ship to a vote died a castaway on a beach. And it wasn't only the weak captains who lived on that leash. Consider how the greatest of them all got the job in the first place. In 1719, a Welsh mate named Bartholomew Roberts was working aboard a slave ship off the coast of Africa when pirates took the vessel and forced him to join them. He'd wanted no part of it. 6 weeks later, the pirate captain was killed in an ambush ashore, and the company had to choose a new leader. They didn't simply hand it to the loudest man or the cruelest. They held an election. One faction put Robert's name forward, a newcomer barely a month and a half into the life, because he could navigate and because he had nerve and a sharp tongue on him, and the crew voted him in. He took the honor with grim humor, reasoning that since he'd already dirtied his hands and was a pirate now, whether he liked it or not, he'd rather give the orders than take them. Within 3 years, that reluctant conscript would seize more than 400 ships and become the most feared man on the ocean. He got the job the same way a coward lost his, by a vote of the men. And even Roberts, at the very height of that power, still felt the leash. Johnson says he surrounded himself with a kind of privy council, a half dozen of the toughest men aboard, just to keep his own command steady. And in the last stretch of his reign, a faction was already forming to vote him out. Death got to him before the ballot did. The greatest captain of them all was still, on any given morning, one bad vote from finished. That is why a good pirate captain walked a razor's edge. A man who was too cautious let prizes slip away, and his crew soon soured on him. One who was too reckless got men killed, and they soured on him even faster. He served at their pleasure, and they never let him forget it. So if the captain wasn't the real day-to-day power, who was? This is the part the movies drop entirely. The most important man aboard, most days, wore no grand title and gets almost no screen time in the legend. He was the quartermaster. The crew elected him separately, right after they chose the captain, and here is what mattered most. The captain could not remove him. His entire job was to represent the men against the man in charge. Johnson called the quartermaster a humble imitation of the Roman tribune of the people, the officer whose whole purpose was to speak for the crew and guard their interests. On most questions of the ordinary running of the ship, Johnson wrote, the captain could undertake nothing the quartermaster didn't approve. Look at what he actually held in his hands. He divided the plunder, coin by coin and share by share, and if he shorted the men, they'd know, and he'd answer for it. He controlled the food and the fresh water, which on a long cruise is another way of saying he controlled who suffered and who didn't. He kept the account books. He settled the daily quarrels before they turned into something worse. When a prize was taken, it was often the quartermaster who led the boarding party and decided what cargo was worth keeping. And just as often it was the quartermaster who took command of the captured ship, and he ran the discipline. A pirate captain couldn't simply flog a man on a whim the way a naval officer could. Minor offenses went to the quartermaster. Serious ones went to a jury of the crew, a dozen or so men who heard the accused out, weighed what the witnesses said, and then voted on his guilt and his punishment. The captain had no special standing in that courtroom. He sat as one voice among many, the same as the man he'd led into battle the week before. When a prize was carried, every man aboard would gather and watch the quartermaster bring the goods up and call out the shares, out loud, in front of everyone. Doing it in the open was the point. Every man could see the pile, see the count, and see that the rules were being followed to the letter, so no one had to take anyone's word for it. If the men thought the quartermaster or the captain had crossed a line, they could call a council on the spot and put it to a vote, and the captain could be overruled by the very crew he'd just led into a fight. The captain took over when it was time to fight. Almost everything else in the life of the ship belonged to the quartermaster. For carrying all of that, he drew a slightly larger share than the men, and that extra cut was really a measure of how far they trusted him, because he was the man holding the common purse, 2 elected offices, built on purpose, each one a check on the other, so that no single man could turn the ship into his private kingdom. None of that is an accident. Somebody engineered it, deliberately, out of hard experience. Now, having a design on paper is one thing. Holding a crew of armed, angry, half-drunk men to it is another thing entirely. So the articles didn't stop at who's in charge. They got specific, and they got hard, about behavior. And once you read the actual rules, the loose cannon image falls apart in your hands. Take Roberts' own articles, the fullest set that survives, written down by Johnson within 2 years of the man's death. And they weren't one man's invention. Several crew's codes come down to us, from captains like George Lowther, Edward Lowe, and John Phillips. And the opening articles of Lowther's set and Roberts' set line Up almost word for word. That overlap is the tell. These weren't private whims dreamed up by a single leader. They were a shared body of law, copied and carried from crew to crew across the whole pirate world. And the fact that it was written down, or at least fixed and read aloud and sworn to, changed everything. An unwritten custom can be bent by whoever happens to be strongest that day. A rule that every man has heard, agreed to, and can hold you to, is a much harder thing to break. By setting the terms down in advance, before the gold was on the table and tempers were up, they took the decisions out of the heat of the moment and settled them while everyone was still calm and sober enough to be fair. No gaming for money, at cards or dice. Gambling turned shipmates into enemies over debts, so it was simply forbidden. The lights and candles out at 8 o'clock at night. If any man still wanted to drink after that hour, he did it up on the open deck, in the dark. And that rule wasn't about early bedtimes. A wooden ship was soaked in tar and packed with gunpowder, and an unattended candle below decks could turn the whole company into a fireball in minutes, so the flames went out on a schedule. Keep your piece, your pistols, and your cutlass clean and ready for service. Your weapons were the entire crew's insurance, and a fouled gun in the heat of a boarding action could get every man aboard killed. There was even an article that no man could so much as talk of breaking up the company and quitting until each of them had earned £1,000, a clause designed to keep the crew bound to the enterprise until the job paid off. Another set aside the ship's musicians a day of rest on the Sabbath. These are not the house rules of a floating party. These are the standing orders of men who understood exactly how fast a ship full of weapons could turn on itself. 2 more articles tell you just how seriously they took that danger. No boy or woman was to be allowed aboard at all, and a man who smuggled a woman to sea in disguise faced death for it. That reads brutally harsh to us, and it was. But the reasoning behind it was cold and practical. Rivalry and jealousy over a woman, or a boy, inside a sealed wooden box crammed with armed and idle men, was seen as a straight road to killing, so they closed the road entirely. The rule had nothing to do with morality. It was crowd control, keeping 90 men from putting a knife in each other over something that wasn't gold. And then comes the article that flips the whole cliché on its head. No striking one another on board. You could not fight on the ship. If 2 men had a real quarrel, the kind that couldn't be talked down, it did not get settled with fists below decks or a blade in the dark. It got held over until they made land. Then the quartermaster took both men ashore, onto the beach, with the whole crew watching. He loaded their pistols himself. He stood them back to back, marched them out a set distance, turned them, and on the signal they fired. If both men missed, they went to their cutlasses, and the first to draw blood was declared the winner, and the matter was closed. First blood, not death, and that detail matters. Killing a good fighting hand over a private grudge helped nobody. The rule let 2 men settle their business in the open, under terms everyone had agreed to, and then put it behind them for good. It was savage, and it was formal, and that formality is the entire point. Even their bloodshed had a procedure. A duel with a referee and rules, ashore, in daylight, instead of a murder in the dark that would split the crew in 2. They took the single most dangerous thing on the ship, 2 men who wanted each other dead, and they put it inside the law. Which leaves the question that every system of government has to answer. What do you do with the men who break the rules anyway? A state has jails and gallows. A pirate crew had a ship, an open ocean, and one punishment they feared more than hanging: marooning. The word comes from the Spanish cimarron, meaning something wild, something that has run off and gone feral. What the pirates did with it was the coldest thing in the entire code. A man condemned to be marooned was rowed out to a spit of sand, not a green island out of an adventure novel, a bare sandbar, often barely clear of the tide, with no fresh water, no food, and no shade. They left him with the clothes on his back, a bottle of water, a single pistol, and a little powder and shot. By tradition, that charge of powder was measured for one purpose. A man couldn't hunt with it, and he couldn't signal a passing ship with it. He could use it to end his own life, once the thirst and the sun became more than he could bear. Then his shipmates climbed back into the boat and rowed away, and the sea and the heat did the rest. There was a cold logic even to that. No single man had to be the one who killed him, so no blood feud could start over it. The sentence had come from all of them together, and the ocean carried it out. And every man left in the boat rowed away carrying the same clear lesson about what the company did to anyone who broke faith with it. And this was no spur-of-the-moment cruelty. The punishment was written straight into the articles. In Roberts's code, and in Phillips's code, Marooning is the named penalty for the crimes a crew could not forgive. And look closely at what those crimes were. At the top of the list, ahead of almost anything, sat theft, stealing from the company, cheating your own shipmates out of their share of the plunder. Because the whole machine ran on trust, on every single man believing the split would be straight and the rules would hold. And a thief in the ranks poisoned that at the root. Desertion earned the sandbar too, running out on the men beside you or abandoning your post partway through a fight. The pirates even had a grim little joke for the man they left behind on the sand. They'd made him governor of his own island. Nobody stayed amused for very long. Marooning rarely killed a man cleanly or quickly. It left him to die by inches, and that slow, uncertain end was the whole cruelty of it. It wasn't even always fatal, and that matters, because it tells you they meant it as a terrible risk rather than a guaranteed execution. The pirate Edward England was marooned by his own crew on an island in the Indian Ocean, and he actually got off it, cobbling together a small boat and reaching Madagascar, where he died broke not long after. That thin, cruel chance of survival was exactly the point. The fear of that beach hung over every man who might have been tempted to skim from the common chest, and a crew this dangerous held together in large part because of it. So step back and take in the whole machine at once. A written contract every man signs. An elected leader who can be fired at will. A second elected officer built specifically to check the first. A vote for the entire crew on anything that matters. Trials by a jury of peers. Fixed penalties, set down in advance. It is a small, harsh, floating republic, and it raises a genuinely uncomfortable question. How did all this stack up against the government these men had actually run away from? Because most of them came off Royal Navy ships and merchantmen, and the comparison is not a close one. In the Navy of that era, a common sailor very often hadn't chosen to be there at all. Press gangs roamed the ports with clubs, seized men off the streets and out of the taverns and straight off homebound merchant ships, and hauled them aboard by force, for years at a stretch, whether they had families waiting or not. A pressed man had no say in whether he served, where he sailed, or when he'd see land again. Aboard, discipline came off the back of a lash. A flogging at the gratings could run to dozens of strokes, laid on in front of the whole assembled crew, and there was no jury, no appeal, and no vote. The captain answered to the Admiralty far away, and to no one at all on that deck. Once there, he had no vote in anything, ever. He could be flogged bloody at his captain's word under the Articles of War, and that captain answered to no jury of the men he commanded. And when a Navy ship took a rich prize, the money split by law into eighths, and the captain alone took 2 of those eighths, a full quarter of the entire haul, to one man. The whole lower deck, sometimes 200 or 300 sailors, divided a single quarter among all of them. Now set the pirate arrangement beside it. The captain and the quartermaster each took a share and a half, sometimes 2. The gunner and the boatswain, a share and a quarter. Every ordinary hand, 1 full share. The distance between the top man and the bottom man had shrunk to almost nothing. The historian Marcus Rediker called these crews democratic in an undemocratic age, and egalitarian in a hierarchical one. And when you line the 2 pay books up beside each other, it's hard to argue with him. On a Navy ship, the gap between the top man's cut and a common sailor's could run into the hundreds to 1. Aboard a pirate crew, it was rarely more than 2 to 1. Sit with the choice a real sailor faced. He could be seized against his will, worked under the lash with no say and no vote, and stand on deck to watch one officer pocket a quarter of a prize he'd bled for. Or he could put his name to a set of pirate articles and get a vote on everything, a jury of his mates if he was ever accused, a cut nearly equal to the captain's, and the standing right to fire that captain. Both roads ended at a noose if the wrong ship ran you down. But only one of them treated an ordinary man as though he had any stake at all in his own life. The king's ship ran on the lash. The pirate ship ran on a signature. It is not hard to see why men made the jump, and why so very few of them ever wanted to go back. So let's put the myth itself on trial, the one we opened with. The all-powerful pirate captain, the tyrant who ruled his deck by fear. Is it true? Here is the honest verdict, and it lands on both sides. For a few violent minutes at a time, yes, it's completely true. In the chase and in the heat of battle, a pirate captain really did hold absolute, unanswerable power over every man aboard. And a small handful of them, Edward Teach, Roberts himself, carried enough sheer personal menace to bend a crew to their will well beyond the fighting. The legend didn't come from nowhere. It grew straight out of those minutes. and out of those few frightening men. But the legend takes those minutes and stretches them across the whole voyage, and that is precisely where it snaps. Because the rest of the time, the tyrant sat on a leash the crew could yank on any morning they chose, and every so often they did exactly that. Charles Vane learned it in a single show of hands. That is the part worth carrying out of this. These men were not running away from rules. They wrote more of them, and harder ones, than the Navy ever bothered to enforce. What they were running from was rules they'd had no hand in making and no power on earth to change. Give a man a vote, a fair share, and a captain he can dismiss, and it turns out he'll shoulder a code stricter than the king's own and defend it to the last. They didn't hate authority. They hated authority they couldn't vote out. So here's the one to argue about down in the comments. Of all the articles, lights out at 8, no gambling, no fighting on board, no woman aboard, on pain of death, which single rule would you have refused to put your name to, knowing that the sandbar was waiting for the men who broke it? Make your case below. I read them. And if you still think the captain in the long coat was mostly for show, wait until you meet the one man who really did try to rule his crew by pure terror and what that finally cost him. Edward Teach. Blackbeard. That one's next.